On behalf of the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health, I warmly welcome each of you to today's webinar, Taking Stock of the Calls to Action on Sport and Reconciliation for First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. We are very happy that we have three speakers here today, Dr. Janice Forsyth, Ms. Caralynn Nault, and Ms. Kukik Baker, who will present 6 years after the release of the findings of the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. My name is Roberta Stout, and I'm a research associate with the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health. Our center is located at the University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George, the traditional territory of the Clay-Claytonay First Nation. I am, however, zooming in from Winnipeg, in beautiful Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis. I will be facilitating today's webinar. Very briefly, the NCCIH is one of 6 national collaborating centers for public health that was established in 2005 with funding from the Public Health Agency of Canada. Our sister NCCs are focused on specific topic areas, including infectious diseases, environmental health, healthy public policy, determinants of health, and methods and tools for knowledge translation. Our center supports health equity for First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples by promoting the use of Indigenous-informed evidence to transform practice, policy, and program decision-making across all sectors of public health. So many of you are now very familiar with the Zoom webinar platform. However, I just want to go over a few issues here so that we're all understanding how this will work. So all of the questions for panelists, as well as technical questions, can be submitted in the Q&A window located at the bottom of your screen. Any links will be shared through the chat window. And today's webinar is being recorded and available on the NCCIH website. There's also the ability to have a live transcription option that's also located at the bottom of your screen. And you can anticipate some brief pauses as we transition between speakers. So in terms of the learning objectives for today, what we're going to be looking at is understanding what it means to have safe spaces and practices for physical activity and sport and recreation for Indigenous peoples generally, and for youth, women, and Two-Spirit peoples specifically. We are also going to be exploring community-driven, culturally grounded, and distinctions-based opportunities for on-the-land physical activities for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and the benefits these provide for mental health and healing. And we'll also touch upon what has been done towards moving the TRC's calls to action around sport and reconciliation, and what continues to be needed to move these forward. So as I said, we have 3 speakers today. We will be starting with Dr. Janice Forsyth, who is a member of the Fisher River Cree Nation. She's an associate professor in sociology and the director of the Indigenous Studies at Western University in London, Ontario. Her research combines history and sociology to explore the relationship between sport and culture from Indigenous points of view. And this has earned significant national and international attention over the past 10 years. In addition, sorry, my page was in the way. Sorry about that. I'll put it down. How about that? In addition to her 2013 co-edited collection, Aboriginal Peoples in Sport in Canada, Historical Foundations and Contemporary Issues, being a standard text in many classrooms throughout Canada. Her award-winning monograph, Reclaiming Tom Longboat, Indigenous Self-Determination in Canadian Sport, published in 2020, continues to generate positive attention in scholarly and literary circles internationally. This attention has translated into other forms of recognition. In 2012, she was named a recipient of the Premier's Research Excellence Award for Ontario. The final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which was published in 2015, cited several of her publications demonstrating how her research is relevant beyond sport. And in 2019, she was elected to the College of the Royal Society of Canada for her research and advocacy on sport and reconciliation. Dr. Forsyth is an experienced leader in the Canadian nonprofit sector, where she is currently the Vice President for the Aboriginal Sports Circle, a national not-for-profit that provides advocacy and support for Indigenous-led sport development in Canada, and a director for the Ontario Physical and Health Education Association, which reaches nearly 2.1 million youth through 72 school boards and 4,934 schools across Canada. I also understand that in September, Dr. Forsyth, along with two others, published A History of Excellence, The Untold Stories of Manitoba's Indigenous Sport. I want to warmly welcome Janice Forsyth to present her presentation at this point. Thank you.
Tansi, and thank you, Roberta. It's also good to know that someone else has notes, because I rely on my notes when I do these sorts of things. So welcome, everybody. I want to thank you for joining me and us today, and to say how honored I am to be presenting here virtually, as well as alongside my colleagues in this webinar. Of course, I also want to thank Roberta and her colleagues at the NCCIH for inviting me to be a part of today's conversation, which is really important. Sport and physical activity and physical education, I believe, are the foundation for healthier youth and healthier communities. And I see it every day in the work that I do. And so I'm a strong advocate for these types of conversations. I'm currently living and working in London, Ontario, and this is, I'm in the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape and the Attawandaron peoples in Treaty 6. And these are on lands connected to the London Township and Sabra Treaties of 1796, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. So like most people here in London too, I am merely a visitor on these lands, and I certainly appreciate being able to work and live here. So I'm going to skip over what I do for research and advocacy, because I think Roberta covered that really well. So thank you so much for doing that. But I do want to say that over the past several years, I've been asked to do a lot of speaking about the relationship between sport, truth, and reconciliation. And I think this is really important, because we really need to understand the context and have more conversations around the relationship between those 3 points: sport, truth, and reconciliation, because it is very much connected to Canada's history of genocide. It's intertwined with that history, and we need to make these complex legacies visible in our present day, so that we can collectively unpack them and continue to address them. So what I'm going to do is screen share, because I do have a PowerPoint, and I'll run through that it helps to guide our conversation. So what I want to do is just talk about 3 things very briefly. I know we have 15 minutes and it's not a lot of time. More than happy to participate in the Q&A, where I can talk more about the calls to action, if that's where the conversation goes. The first point that I want to talk about, though, is how did we get here? And this is the historical roadmap that I've spent quite a few years building and do a lot of talking about with different groups of people. The second point is sport a culturally neutral activity? And this is where the sociology comes in. And so we're going to have a look at that from a sociological response, because again, it helps us to unpack why we're here and how we can build a better way forward. And then finally, what do we do now? What's at stake in terms of building our futures together? There's a couple of terms that I'm going to use in the webinar. I use sport generally to mean like a wide constellation of things. And I interchange that with physical culture. When I do research, I'm a little bit more specific about my terminology, but in presentations like this, I tend to blend them. So I'll use sport and physical culture interchangeably when I need to refer to something very specific like organized sport or physical activity or physical education, then I'll use those specific terms. And I'd be more than happy to explain that later if there's any confusion. So the first part, how did we get here? A historical roadmap. First, I want to talk about education and schooling. And for me, one of the key pieces of research in this whole history is Shinguak's vision. Many of you are probably familiar with it. It's Shinguak's Vision, A History of Native Residential Schools. It was published by J.R. Miller in 1996. And in there, he talks about the difference between education and schooling. He makes a distinction between the two. And this is really important because oftentimes those two terms are used interchangeably, education and schooling, as if they were the same thing, but they're not the same thing. They're vastly different. And they're very different ways of socializing children into a broader culture. And the basic difference is that whereas education is a process that all cultures of the world engage in, not all cultures use schooling to educate their young. And if we think about that for a minute and we apply it to sport or physical culture, we can see something similar where the way in which we use our bodies is a form of education. Whatever you do with our bodies is always a type of education, but we don't always educate our bodies in the same way as other cultures. Not every culture in the world, for instance, did organize sport. So it's a really important distinction just to keep in your mind for a minute. So just to reinforce this and to kind of bring it home, I want to talk about this concept of home on the land. Because prior to European settlement in Canada, Indigenous people lived on the land, and to do so, they needed to be fit. And so they trained for survival on the land. And to do that, they had their own games and contests that they engaged in. And these were much more than fun pastimes. They actually built the skills and competencies that they needed for their land-based lifestyles. And so these games and contests were essential for survival. They were required training, if you will, for life on the land. And so equally important to that, their games and contests reinforced their connection to the land because the land was actually their home. And their home meant traveling on the land. It wasn't like one fixed address like we have today. And their traveling on the land meant that they had a rich and detailed understanding of their traditional territories, which means they knew exactly where to go and when to travel on the land. And this was knowledge that was handed down through the generations. And that's why Europeans depended on them for survival, because they knew how to traverse the land without calamity. They knew which parts of the land to walk over, which parts of the water to traverse, and of course, which parts to avoid. They knew where to get the fish, the game, the edible berries for survival, as well as the good materials for shelter. So the land was their home, and it was the place that they traveled on. And Indigenous relationships to their land and their land-based lifestyles were undercut with the development of the nation state in the 1800s, where the nation state wanted access to those lands for nation building, for settlement, for industry and commerce. And we have ongoing encroachments on our lands today for resource development. So the way in which we were connected to that Indigenous people, we were connected to our land, has been undercut by the development of the nation state. And this had profound implications for Indigenous physical culture, for the way we moved our bodies, for our games and contests, as well as for our identities and our overall health. Soon after, in the late 1800s, we begin to see formal restrictions on Indigenous ceremonies. Many of you are probably familiar with what we call the potlatch law or the potlatch ban, or what is called the potlatch law or the potlatch ban. That was part of the Indian Act. And this is when church and state officials put into writing, put into legislation their frustration about what they saw as being a lack of spiritual and economic progress among Indigenous people. And they attributed the problems not to their own cultural biases or to the impoverished environments in which Indigenous people had been forced into, but to Indigenous people's ongoing participation in their so-called backward beliefs and practices. And they characterized Indigenous ceremonies such as the potlatch and the Sundance, which could be extremely physically demanding, as deviant and immoral, especially in some cases in the prairies. And they also said that it left people poor and that it was counterproductive to Christian conversion. And so they tried to stamp out these practices which were fundamental to their identities and their cultures. And of course, if you take a look at white settlement culture at this point in time, they had their own physical practices that were, for many people, were abhorrent as well. So for instance, you could get men of the genteel class, they could still legally engage in a duel to the death, in the late 1800s, or consider, for instance, the history of boxing, where by the late 1800s, early 1900s, many people believe that the bloody sport of boxing, if it was conducted properly with scientific rules, that it could be a vital training ground for boys and men. And so, of course, these brutal practices, the duel and boxing that were practiced by the Europeans, they were sometimes challenged, but they were still legal, right? Even if someone died as a result of the contest. So what we have then by the late 1800s and early 1900s is the imposition of these Euro-Canadian physical cultural practices that are used to change fundamentally Indigenous ways of life. And so we have, as well, the residential schools. And this is where the bulk of my research lies, is in sports and games and residential schools. And we have the full force of the residential schools by the late 1800s and early 1900s. And the schooling system further undercut Indigenous ties to land and to Indigenous youth, their sense of self as members of Indigenous nations, and indeed, of course, to their entire way of life. And the schools and the way in which sports and physical activities were picked up and used in the schools were used to reinforce settler ideas about what was appropriate in a modern day context. So what we see beginning in the late 1800s, but even before that, but really it really starts to take shape in the late 1800s and becomes dominant through the 1900s in both the residential and the day schools, are these ideas about what was appropriate physical culture for Indigenous boys and girls. And this means about, what kind of movement was considered to be healthy, about what was proper bodily comportment, what it looked like, about the proper separation of work and leisure, about instilling deference to authority, about ideas about sporting nationalism. For instance, what sports signified Canada and what kind of athletes signified Canada, and a whole other range of deep meanings that were integral to the program of assimilation. And so there are many, many, many instances in the historical record where school officials and government officials and church officials state that physical education and organized sports were actually more effective than the classroom in bringing about fundamental changes in the values and behaviors of the students. And in fact, we know that sports was absolutely central to moving the students into the public school system in the latter half of the 1900s, beginning in around 1950. Because without the kids saying a word when they were involved in sports or physical activities, their movements conveyed meanings that the settlers recognized, suggesting that the residential schools were working and that the kids could in fact be offloaded to the public school system. And so here you have in front of you just one of many examples of a state official commenting on the need for more sport and recreation activities and getting kids involved with so-called public school systems, the white teams, in order to facilitate assimilation. And importantly, Jan Eisenhart here, who was actually a friend of mine, He was the first supervisor of physical education and recreation at Indian Affairs, and that letter that you see in front of you, or that comment that you see from a report in front of you, is from October of 1950. So then what does this brief history show and tell us? Because the history is much broader and deeper than that. But what does this history show and tell us? I think one of the important threads in this kind of a discussion needs to be, I mean, is sport a culturally neutral activity? I often find in the spaces that I travel in, people don't think about sport or physical activity or physical education as a type of socialization, which it actually is. And so it's important to ask, is sport a culturally neutral activity, or variations of that question? And I think based on the history that I just showed you, the obvious answer is no. Of course, it's not a neutral activity. Sports and other types of physical activities, the whole constellation of physical culture, are vehicles to socialize people into a particular society, into a particular culture, whether it be Indigenous culture, of a particular nation, whether it be white mainstream culture, whether it be a specific sporting culture like a hockey culture or a basketball culture, or some sort of complex culture or a combination of two or more cultures. So sport and physical activities and physical education, the whole constellation of physical culture, is deeply meaningful and consequential. And just as the students in the Indian residential school system then were forced to speak and learn and think in English, and this shaped their entire worldview, they were also required to adopt new physical behaviors that were meant to supplant their own ways of knowing and being and thinking. And so with that, I recognize that the work that we all do is a complex cultural terrain when we work in this field in sport, recreation, physical activity, physical education, and so on. And just quickly, a quick example of this that I often do with my students or in presentations is just very quickly, take a look at the images in front of you. Just quickly take a look at them and imagine what is the first word or the first thought that came to mind when you took a look at these pictures. For instance, was there one image that you found most beautiful, or one that you found most startling, or one that you were maybe most unsure of? And ask yourself why. Conversely, ask yourself which one does not grab your attention or perhaps even turn you off, and ask yourself why. So our responses to these images speak volumes about our own cultural attitudes towards physical culture, including sport, physical activity, and physical education. And this means that movement, what it signifies, is never apolitical. There is always consequence and meaning that stems from moving bodies. So ideas about appropriate physical culture have always been wrapped up in efforts to conquer new lands, whether in Canada or elsewhere, because the brief history that I gave you in Canada isn't really unique. The patterns are, very similar in other colonized areas of the world. European missionaries, government agents, and other imperial authorities, particularly those from the British Empire, have a long track record of attempting to bring Indigenous nations and people under control by constraining and regulating their physical movements. These newcomers were intrigued by Indigenous peoples' strength, speed, agility, and endurance, which they developed from their land-based lifestyles, as much as they were appalled and even threatened by what Indigenous physical activity signified. And that was independence, sovereignty, and difference, all of which had to be eliminated and replaced with these new embodied practices in order for the new Dominion of Canada to take shape. And we see the different conversion strategies throughout history, the creation of reserves, the limitation of their subsistence practices by imposing restrictions on hunting and fishing rights, by prohibiting cultural practices with schooling, and so on and so on. And all of this did cause profound harm, but it did not kill or erase or completely rupture Indigenous culture. So here we are today, and we wonder, what do we do now? What's at stake in the years ahead? Well, we have the calls to action for sport. And in my experience, in my view, those are a good start. And I think it's really important that we have those calls to action as kind of a guiding framework to think about what lies ahead in the future. But like other sectors that are building out what decolonization means, what truth and reconciliation means, whatever framework they're using, those calls to action are mere stepping stones to build out that larger framework. And I really do think and hope that that is where we're at in the sport and physical activity and physical education sector. So for me, I see three broad things happening in the future. One is that more people need to understand how colonization is tied to physical culture, health, and identity. And that way we will all be in a better position to address the barriers. And this is really important, especially for people who are in positions of decision-making power in the mainstream. For instance, offering more sport, more of the same, is not the answer. In the same way that teaching more English to our youth, our Indigenous youth, without a corresponding focus on Indigenous language, detracts from our aspirations for cultural renewal, nationhood, and sovereignty. Number two, it's important to recognize the complex network around physical culture and health in Canada so that you know where you can be most effective. What we have in Canada are separate sectors. Sport, physical activity, and physical education operate in silos, and there's a multitude of powerful actors and interests that shape what can happen. It's important to understand the policy context that you work within, and that the actors themselves understand the environment they're working within. And building on that last point, it's important to create effective policy or a broader framework that coordinates this complex network, because what we have right now are people running out into the field trying to do their best, as they do in a lot of other sectors, and this isn't working. What we need is to bring focus and clarity to Indigenous needs and interests in Canada. There's a need for an Indigenous-led framework or frameworks that bring relevant actors and sectors into conversation with one another, working vertically across departments and laterally from top to down in all of these different sectors. So I'm more than happy to talk about the calls to action, specific calls to action. But from my point of view, 6 years on, I think we're at a moment in time where we actually need a larger framework that creates something more effective for us to coordinate our interests. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope I didn't go over the 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Forsyth, for that wonderful presentation. We did receive comments in the Q&A box about several of the slides and just the need to share them more broadly with students. And another comment that came in was just awesome. So I do invite folks to ask any Q&A, any questions in the Q&A box for any of the speakers as you listen to each of the presentations. I want to invite Ms. Caralynn Nault to open up her video at this point. Caralynn works for Waterways Manitoba, which is an Indigenous-led nonprofit that works to support community wellness by using canoeing and outdoor recreation to connect Indigenous youth to culture, cultural skills, and identities. Caralynn is a program leader for the Intercommunity Canoe Program. Caralynn is a Métis woman living in Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of her people. She has a particular calling to create spaces for other Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people to feel safe and celebrated in sport and recreation. Through her work and her personal life, she has experienced the joy, empowerment, and healing that movement and connection to the land and the water brings to people of all ages, and loves to share it with others whenever given the chance. She has also done work with creating and speaking at the annual TRC and sport event hosted by the Manitoba Aboriginal Sports and Recreation Council, which was designed to educate the provincial sport organizations of Manitoba on the importance and implementation of the calls to action. So welcome, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Tashikiwa, Caralynn Nault, Dishnakashin, Mina Misku Webenus Ikwe, Dishnakashin, Winnipeg Dosche, Michifnia. So, hello everyone, my name is Caralynn Nault. My spirit name is Red Cloth Woman. I live in Winnipeg and I am a Chif or Métis. And first thing I would like to do is I would like to start out by saying a great big thank you to Roberta and the NCCIH for inviting me to be part of this presentation. And I would like to also just honor Janice and Kukik as well, being invited to be a part of a webinar where these are the other two speakers that I am invited to speak with has just been amazing. These two women are absolute powerhouses in what they've accomplished and their impact. So I'm very, very happy and awestruck to be to be a part of this. So just bear with me if it seems like I'm a little nervous. It's probably because I am. So so I don't have a presentation. My presentation is more story based. So I would like to start off with a little bit of the work that I do with Waterways. We are a relatively young nonprofit. We're an Indigenous nonprofit in Manitoba. And like Roberta said in my introduction, we use primarily canoeing and other outdoor recreation, working to connect our Indigenous youth with their culture, their identity, and empower them in becoming who they are. So my job essentially in the summer as one of the leads for the intercommunity canoe program, myself and my partner, James Lavallee, we packed up 10 canoes and put them on a trailer. And all summer we went from community to community. Each week we were somewhere different and just basically did some programming with the youth in each place. And of course, it was very different depending on where we were, what kind of body of water we were on, the youth that we had with us that week. So it's very, very grassroots, very spontaneous in a lot of ways. Of course, we do have a structure of like the things that we definitely want to teach as far as the knowledge of the safety of being on the water and basic skills of canoeing and that. But the rest is as long as the kids are enjoying themselves and having fun and getting to be outside and on the land and interact with it in a holistic way of play and moving their bodies, that's what's most important for me. I guess I can tell you a story about how I kind of came to this realization that this work is so important and has become a calling for me. Before I worked with Waterways, I worked with the Manitoba Aboriginal Sports and Recreation Council, which is the PTASB for Manitoba. And in that time coming into working within a sport organization and specifically an Indigenous sport organization, there was a lot of reflection and learning that kind of went into fulfilling my role within this sector. And I remember thinking back upon my whole life and my experiences as a youth, because I did always participate in different sports growing up. And I actually grew up in northern BC. So although I was born here and most of my family is here, I grew up pretty isolated from my extended family and also from my culture. But I do remember when my mère and père would come to visit us, and this would maybe happen once a year or so if we were lucky. And my père would always bring his fiddle. And I just remember this being such a special, powerful experience within our family. Like as soon as he took out that case, his leather case that his fiddle was in, and he would take out his bow and rosin it up. And I remember being a little kid, like maybe 3 or 4 or 5, like not very old at all, and just being so excited, like this feeling of like, oh my gosh, this is so exciting. And yeah, I just remember as he would start to play and all my whole family was just gathered around, and there was like this feeling like deep inside of me where it was like, I have to move, like I have to move my body. And just like this little kid. Like, I don't have any idea what I'm doing. I just know that how I'm moving feels amazing in my body and it feels so great. And my family's all laughing and all the adults are, oh, look, she's doing the Red River jig. But really my legs are just flailing all over the place. I have no idea what I'm doing. But that feeling of knowing that my spirit was present in that movement and in that way of moving my body in a way that was completely unrestricted and safe and celebrated in that moment was so powerful that it's lasted my entire life up until now. I still remember that. And as I was reflecting back upon my experience in sport and other movement endeavors, it was like that was always missing. Like as a youth growing up, it was like there was never a place in my sport experiences or in my recreation where I was allowed to be so holistically present, like my spirit and my culture and having that celebrated. And even in some of my experiences as a female and participating in sport in some relatively male dominated sports, it was very clear that I was in fact unwelcome in my entire identity. So that's something that I now have come to see how important that is and how powerful that is, and how much the holistic experience of play in our movement has really been stripped from sport experiences in the mainstream. It was like you have to learn these very specific skills. You have to move your body in exactly this way, otherwise you are doing it wrong and it is not good enough. So, and I think we really need to move away from that and reclaim the holistic sense of play that that we did always have. Like traditionally our ancestors, that's how we learned. That's how we learned to hunt, to survive, was always by play as children, and climbing and jumping and running and all of these things that should just be so so natural and allowed, but now have become so restricted. And now coming into my work with waterways, my coworker James Lavely, who I've already mentioned once, he is actually a co-founder of Waterways, and he's also a close friend. I am happy to say we've become friends through working together this summer. But I remember him telling me he's a world-class paddler. He competed with Team Canada, and I remember him telling me about his experience in deciding to stop competing. Was that paddling is traditionally, it's an Indigenous activity, and he was looking around in these competitions and seeing very, very few Indigenous athletes. And it's like, how can this be possible when this entire activity is something that our ancestors have created? So that was part of how Waterways was born. And I'm very, very fortunate to get to be a part of its growth now. And I see that so much whenever we go into communities, just creating that space where the youth are allowed to show up as their whole selves and be, you know, whoever they are that day, or just have the safety to get to experiment with different things, with things they haven't experienced before. And the growth that you see in these kids in such a short time is amazing. And for me, this really translates over to um, making sure that we also provide this opportunity for our adults as well, like that opportunity for play. One of the most powerful things when we go to communities, you see when the adults interact with the kids and you see them playing like big children, and everyone's laughing, like laughing so hard they've got tears. And it's like, yes, like that's what I'm here for. This is it. This is the important part. And I also believe that that's important to make spaces specifically just for our women to be in community with one another, for it just to be women, for it to be a safe space to try things we've never tried before, and you know, have it be awkward and it be safe to laugh at ourselves and each other, and it be just a healthy way to interact with each other and in a physical way. And so one thing that I try and always do is wherever we go, I always try and at least host one night that's like a women's introduction to paddling night. So it's like, doesn't matter if you've never even seen a canoe before in your life, that's totally fine. Come on out, we'll get you all geared up with the life jackets and paddles and everything else you need. And we just get out on the water, and we either we'll go for like a short little paddle, just kind of see how everyone's feeling with their confidence and comfortability. Or sometimes I haven't yet gotten any group of women to play a game where we all tip the canoes. There seems to be a little bit, everyone wants to stay pretty dry still, but I'm getting there. I'm gonna do it one of these days. But yeah, that to me is something that is so important, to allow this space for us as women to reconnect with each other, with the water, because in so many of our Indigenous cultures, the connection to the water, especially for women, is so sacred, and it's something that I think we've really been lost and has been taken from us in a lot of different ways. There's so much fear around interacting with water now, with our rivers and our different waterways. So being able to provide the opportunity for us to develop a relationship with our waterways again. So learning the skills that we need to feel safe, to feel comfortable, and to feel confident in going out and doing these activities like canoeing and or paddling or whatever it may be on the water. If we can encourage that in our women, who are our matriarchs for many of our families, if the women can do it, obviously, and feel comfortable doing it, we're going to bring our families to do it. We're going to get our kids out there when they're young, and then our kids are going to grow up with this experience of also having this connection to the water and the comfort and the safety and the confidence that we need to do these things and in ourselves. So that that for me is something that's very, very important, and I think will be very impactful going forward for all of us. Sorry, I'm just checking to make sure I haven't gone over time yet. I could talk for hours about this. And one other thing I do definitely want to also touch on is something that I learned a lot about this summer, was the opportunity for our Two-Spirit youth, or for our trans youth, to claim their identity or step into their identity in a way that they don't normally have the opportunity to do so. In smaller communities, in places where people have known you maybe your whole life or many years by a certain name or a certain role, and just seeing the difference of like when we go into a community and we're meeting these kids for the first time, and we always ask right at the beginning, what are your pronouns, like what is your name, what name do you go by, and giving them the opportunity to really own that and create that relationship with that identity, whereas maybe so many other people in their lives know them as something that they don't actually identify with, was very powerful. I had one youth this summer who had introduced themselves to me with a specific name and a pronoun, and then I was asking them a question in front of one of the adults in the community, and the adult corrected me and says, that's not their name is this. And then so I thought, maybe I got this wrong. Maybe I shouldn't have called them that in front of the adults. So then I was like, okay, I need to have a conversation with this youth and see. So I was kind of waiting for the right time to approach them and talk to them about this. And while I was doing that, they came to me and they said, you know what, thank you so much for referring to me by that name. That is how I feel most comfortable. And that is like, that's me. That's how I identify. So thank you for calling me that and for sticking to that. And I thought, okay, great. Like, I wanted to talk to you about this and see, like, maybe if you only go by this name, not around other adults or not around certain people or something. And they're like, no, like, I would really like for this to be my accepted identity by everybody. So thank you for being a part of that. And that was very, very powerful for me. And it just hit me like, there needs to be more spaces like this. We need to be allowing our youth and our two-spirit people and trans people the opportunity to own their identity and for it to be respected and acknowledged and celebrated. So that was something else that was a big moment for me this summer, and like a realization. Yeah, so that's mostly all the stories that I have that I wanted to share with this group today. Actually, one of the other things that I do want to just touch on really quickly is in working with the calls to action. And this was something that working with non-Indigenous people in the sport realm, so people from the provincial sport organizations in Manitoba, we led some education and sharing circles and things with them where it's like, okay, this is your opportunity to ask the questions that you're not sure if you're asking them the right way or if you're even allowed to ask or things like that. And one of the biggest things was like, we don't know what to do because we're afraid of doing something wrong. And we had a lot of really great conversations about that. It's like, you need to start somewhere. So taking those calls to actions, number 87 to 91, and really shrinking them down, because the way that they are worded is for very, very big systemic changes, which do need to happen. But on an individual basis, when a person is thinking, what can I do to help this become a reality, for this call to action be fulfilled, that's the lens you have to take, is like, what can I do in my in my identity as an individual, in my role maybe with my organization or a sector. Like, am I a policymaker? Do I have decision making power? Am I a coach? Am I a parent of an athlete? And so taking all of these things into consideration and really spending the time to reflect and make it personal to you, what can I do? And then taking that and also acknowledging that we need to start somewhere. If you're not already doing something, just pick one thing to start with. And yes, you might mess it up and you might do it wrong and someone might call you out for it. And that's okay. Like, that's how we learn and how we learn together. And just being willing to become uncomfortable and have uncomfortable conversations that need to happen is how we're going to be able to grow together. So I think that that's something that I'd like to leave you all with too, is start somewhere, pick something, and be okay with it potentially being wrong, and also accept that when someone if you are being called out for it being wrong, hopefully it's in a loving way, but even if it's not, take the learning opportunity and don't stop doing anything because you're like, oh, I did it wrong, that means I can no longer do anything, this isn't my place. But to try again and form connections with it and keep going, keep carrying it. So with that, I would like to say thank you so much for listening to all of my stories and what I've had to say, and watching my presentation that's based mostly on hand movements, I guess, at this point, instead of a PowerPoint. So yes, thank you so much, everybody. And I will invite Roberta back to transition us to our next speaker.
Hi, that was awesome. Very inspiring, as some of the comments have come in. Thank you for bringing water into this discussion and storytelling. So I want to now invite Ms. Kukik Baker to join us. She has lived in Arviat her entire life. She worked as a community mental health youth outreach worker for many years, while she developed key programs for the Akiamavik, where she has continued to work since 2010. She is a founder of the Young Hunters program and has been very active in establishing a formal curriculum, which includes environmental monitoring and training in technologies to support these goals. Although much of Kukik's work experience was as a mental health specialist. She is also a very experienced lands-based person and harvester, and continues to work closely on youth engagement around this. She initiated several other food security and climate change projects. She has been very actively promoting food security issues, especially through cooking with country foods. Kukik has been involved in all of Akiamavik's various research initiatives, working with Southern research partners, designing and providing training workshops in Inuit knowledge, or IQ, research approaches. In 2019, on behalf of the Young Hunters Program, she received the Inuit Tapiri Kanatami Advancement of Youth Award. So welcome, Kukik, and we look forward to hearing from you. I want to remind people that this recording will be made available in the coming weeks on the NCCIH website.
Matna, thanks for the introduction. It's an honor to be here and to be able to share our program and some of the stuff that we do for the Akiumavik Society. I'd like to thank the other presenters for their wonderful presentations. A little bit about myself. I used to play all kinds of sports growing up in a small town. That was basically all you had to do was play sports. And then the rest of it was family time on the land, being active on the land. And so as soon as I turned 18, I started coaching soccer. I coached my younger siblings in soccer, softball, and volleyball. My husband has been an elementary school gym teacher for the last 15 years, I think. So we're very sports-oriented family. As a youth, I started working at summer camp, and we created programming for youth, active programming for youth over the summer. I'm an active hunter, and we take our family camping all year round. And my work with the Akiumavik literally translated into English means wellness, the place to get wellness, Akiumavik. Akiuma is wellness, and Akiumavik means the place to get wellness. So we're a holistic wellness center where we look at our lives holistically. We have the Young Hunters program, men's group program, which is like consensus building elders group. We do therapeutic justice programs on the land. We have a prenatal program, an early years program from pregnancy until 5 years old. We have counseling, and all of that is based on Inuit Qawimayatuqangit, or what Inuit always knew to be true. And every component of our program has on the land healing. With our Young Hunters program, we promote an active lifestyle grounded in IQ, Inuit Qawimayatuqangit. We teach IQ to our youth, and then they also do tool building, so they're building traditional tools, and on the land activities. We promote healthy eating. We do traditional games that encourage strength building, stamina, balance, agility, but also being observant and the ability to listen well. One of our quotes, I'm going to share my screen here. One of the quotes that we always use is from Louis Angalik, who helped to develop our curriculum content. So they would grow in knowledge, start doing things on their own. They're able to help others survive by using the skills that they have learned. And so that was really a key piece to our Young Hunters program. We were always taught that you can be skilled in everything. Like, you can be the most skilled person around, but if you don't use those skills to help the people around you, then you're of no value to the society. And so we want our children and youth to be valued and to have that sense of ownership in the things that they do. And so we really like this quote, and we would like to instill that into all of our participants. Our Young Hunters program is based on Inung'uinak principles. Inung'uinak is building a capable human being. We were taught that you can raise 3 types of children. You could raise an egg, a hardened rock, and a capable human being. And so when you have an egg, it's somebody who's very fragile, and you always have to take care of them. No matter what they do, you always have to take care of them and watch over them, because they're not capable of doing it themselves. Or you can create a hardened rock person who is very angry and hurt, and always feels that the world is against them. And then you could also raise a human being where your child is very capable, and it doesn't matter what the world throws at them, they're able to stand their ground and move forward in life. And so the guiding principles of Inung'uinak, there are 6 Inung'uinak guiding principles that we follow. The first one is to develop habits to live a good life. The second is rising above hardships through continued solution seeking, so a lot of deep thinking. The third one is to build a strong moral character and to be heart-centered. The fourth one is to show compassion, serve others, and pay attention to relationship building. The third is recognizing the uniqueness of individual, because everybody is different. And when we recognize the uniqueness of each individual, it makes our society that much stronger. And the last one is taking steps to making improvements. When we started the Young Hunters program in 2012, we had started it as a food security project. We did a community consultation, and 2 of the key priorities that came out of that was they wanted more country food in people's diets, and they also wanted activities for youth, because Akvet has a very high youth population. We're just over 3,000 people, and we have 60% of that population is under the age of 16. So youth activities was very high on the list for our from our community consultation. So when we started the Young Hunters program, Louis Angalik and Dr. Donald Ulualuak were our elders, and they told us that when we're dealing with youth, you can't teach to their head, because if you teach to their head, then that knowledge won't always be there. In times of trouble, in times of need, the first thing you do is you go to your heart and you listen to what your heart is telling you. And so when you teach to the heart, instead of to the head, they have a better understanding. They're able to draw on that information more readily than they do if it's taught to your head. It creates motivation. It gives the youth a positive attitude and determination. And that's what we want when we're teaching to the heart of our youth. I'm gonna show a video of our program. And then I'll do a little bit more with a slideshow.
Way of life is hard sometimes. There's not much the town offers. You got a lot of kids who have nothing to do.
Since the start of colonization, there's been so much trauma. There's been so much pain. There's been so much hurt. Families ripped apart. My dad's oldest sister was born in an igloo. That's less than 50 years of going from being in igloos and tents, and these kids are growing up without really understanding who they really are, not being able to be nomadic anymore. It's just a sword that goes on and on and on from one generation to the next.
This knowledge gotta be passed down. My name is Jimmy Napayo, and I live in Outlet Nunavut. I'm the Young Hunters Program Coordinator. I get kids and we take them out on the land and they learn their way of life.
We started this program, our community, they wanted more traditional food in their diet and they wanted activities for kids. So we thought, well, why aren't we taking the kids out on the land to teach them how to hunt so that they could provide? Inuit are traditionally very hands-on learners. You were taught by being put front center and learning the traditional skills, learning how to build the tools, learning how to wayfind, learning the different ice conditions. Like you can't learn about the different ice conditions in a book. You can't learn about the different ice conditions sitting in a classroom. You have to be out there to learn by seeing through your binoculars which caribou are the fattest, which caribou are the healthiest, which areas are the best hunting grounds. On the land, hands-on is the best way to teach. It's absolutely the best thing that you'll ever experience.
We're not expecting them to know everything and be men. We're expecting them to have fun, not be so hard on them. Just like be kids, you know? What this land means to us, like everything. It means everything to us.
It's a place where we build memories. It's a place where we live our lives.
After the hunt, they sparkle. They take that caribou, put it in their homes.
Traditionally, we had to share absolutely everything we had to survive. It meant the survival of our people. Why aren't we taking the kids out on the land to teach them how to hunt so that they could provide? I'd like to see this next generation be the generation to get up and make that change.
Helping elders, helping others, sharing for their family. It'd be sad to see the Inuit culture fade away.
Once we take the kids on the land, you can see the difference. They're much happier, they're more active. The last 5 years that we've had the Young Hunters program has just been eye-opening. It was such a good change for them.
So when we take kids into the Young Hunters program, we have various intakes throughout the year. It's a year-round program, and we, just a minute, I'm multitasking. When we have our Young Hunters program, we have 3 different age groups that we look at, that we work with. And so there's the middle school students, the high school, and also the young adults who are aged around 18 to 25, sometimes up to 30. And so with our Young Hunters program, there's 3 different areas in our program. We have Pilim Magsangnak, where they're enhancing skills. So they're learning how to build traditional tools, learning how to skin, learning how to survive on the land, also learning observation skills, because our elders are telling us that our youth don't have observation skills anymore. They're learning how to use power tools safely. They're learning how to use technologies such as GPS, InReach devices, and technologies like Hydroblock. And Hydroblock is a system that we use to map the seabed. And so they're learning about how that's changing through climate change. And then they're also using smart ice technologies where we're measuring the thickness of the ice that we're traveling on. They're also learning how to read weather and use technologies around weather. They're learning how to wayfind, and both with modern technologies and wayfind traditionally, where they're learning how the different snowdrifts form and how you could tell which way the snowdrifts are pointing, and which way you head home according to that. With the skills enhancement, our youth are building self-esteem. They're becoming more capable human beings. And they have life skills, like the tools that they learn how to build, they can start building those on their own and put that into use for future livelihoods. Like a lot of people like to sell ulus or panas and create incomes for their families. And so those skills are learned in the program, but also they're able to use them in their everyday life. The second part of our program is the elders' knowledge, and so they're interacting with the elders. They're learning Inuit Kawimaya Tukangit, the guiding principles that I talked about, and sustainable harvesting. They're learning about the relationship with the land. They're learning about the relationship with other people around, with those around them, with their families, and being able to be a contributing person in our society. And then there's the relationship to the land. So they're taking what they've learned from the elders, they're taking the tools that they've built in the program, and they're putting that into practice on the land when they go on their land trips. So each intake of youth are taken out on land trips, and depending on the time of year, obviously in the winter and spring months, we could do more land activities, and bring more youth with us. So those groups are larger groups, and they could go further out from town and stay out for longer periods of time. In the spring and summer and fall months, it's a little bit harder to get around because you can only go by boat and ATV. So we usually have smaller groups in those times, and all kinds, like Akviat is very blessed with animals. So they do a lot of caribou hunting, muskox hunting, wolf hunting, wolverine, fox trapping, beluga whale hunting, seal hunting. They go on various fishing trips, and throughout their land trips, they're also learning how to be independent, and learning, like if certain situations come up, they're able to do deep thinking to get themselves out of those situations. So they'll be quizzed during the land activities, just like if we're in the boat, if it suddenly gets really windy, what are some things that we could do to keep safe, and what are some things that we could do to move forward? What are some safety tips? And so the kids will start answering those questions and helping each other, because if you don't know the question, then somebody else in the group does. And so when you work together, you have all bases covered, because even if I don't know everything, I know a little bit, the person next to me knows a little bit, and the next person knows a little bit, and together we can help ourselves overcome the obstacle. So it's a lot about relationship building, and being able to do consensus building, so that it's not always my responsibility, it's the responsibility of all of us together. Louis Angalik, when we were talking with him, he was saying that when we first started the program, that kids don't observe anymore. They don't know the weather, they don't know the star constellations, and they don't notice the animals around them or anything. Everybody's glued like this to their phones, to their devices, glued to the TV, playing games. They stay inside their house all the time. And so we wanted to be able to help change that. And so through some of the research aspects of the program, we've been doing ujat suinak, or being observant, learning how to be observant, and doing monitoring. So we've been doing in our bay here, because of it is very flat, we have glacial rebound. So our land is rising. I think it's something like almost a foot every year. And so we have new shoals and reefs that we never used to have in our bay. So more people are hitting their boat's lower unit, and it's causing people to get stuck out on the land, on the water, and it's like $6,000 damage, and on top of having to be rescued, and it's very dangerous situations for people who are not knowledgeable in the areas that they're hunting in. And so we decided we wanted to be able to mark where these dangerous areas are. And so we have partnered with M2 Oceans, and we're using technology called HydroBlock, where it sends signal down to the bottom, and that signal bounces back from the seabed and gives us the depth. And so it's combined with GPS tracking, the sonar, and it will help us create maps where we could show the depths of our seabed, and those maps are shared all throughout town on our Facebook pages. We print copies of the maps and post them with our local Hunters and Trappers organization, through our Hamlet office, search and rescue, and it helps. And anybody who wants a copy of the map are welcome to come and pick some up from our office. And it gives the youth a sense of pride that that's something that they could give back to their community. The other thing that we're doing is looking at the ice density, how thick the ice is, because every year our ice seems to be thinning, and we think that it's like the seabed is warming, and so it's causing thinner ice. And the way our ice breaks up, it used to break up into a whole bunch of ice pans, and then the ice pans would float away from town when ice breakup came. The last few years, our ice has left in one big ice pan instead of breaking up into smaller ice pans, and then it'll kind of go out away from shore, and then it'll sink. And so we wanted to try and figure out what the changes were and how those changes affect our community and our people who use the trails on the ice to go seal hunting or travel between different communities and hunting areas. And so the kids are actively taking out the smart ice kamotik and mapping different areas of the ice where is most commonly used. And they're also working with elders and hunters who use the ice, getting information on where they should be mapping next or what other areas they should be looking at. They're also learning how to identify dangerous areas when they're out there, so they could avoid dangerous areas but still be able to map areas close to the dangers without injuring themselves. So with young hunters, they're also learning kanukto, which is deep thinking. So when they are in those situations of emergency, they're able to draw on that information when they, from being taught to the heart, they're able to draw on those that knowledge and be able to move forward and seek solutions for the different situations that they're in. We're also looking at the health of our animal population. So our caribou, our seal, our beluga, our fish, we're teaching our youth to do samples. So they're learning how to take beluga samples. They're learning how to do necropsy. And all of this is helping them to connect with their environment, to connect with their animals, and to help them to create that relationship, so that when they're not part of the program, they can still draw on those skills and that knowledge, and they'll be that much like we don't want to create youth who don't know what they're doing on the land, because our land is very unforgiving. And so we want them to be very capable to do anything that their heart desires. We had done some evaluation where we asked parents and people in the program, when they go on land trips and they hunt caribou or fish or get freshwater ice or fresh water from lakes and rivers, and part of the program is to give back, and so they deliver country food or fresh water ice or fresh water to their families, to elders, to people in the community who don't have the means to get country food themselves. And so when we had asked those people who had received country food or water or ice from our youth, and also the parents of past participants, what we started out as food insecurity. We were expecting things like, oh yeah, we were so happy to receive country food because we have food to share with our family, and we were expecting that kind of stuff. And we did get some of those responses, but a lot of the responses that we got was, my child is so much happier now. My child is getting up earlier in the morning, going to school more often, not lazing around playing video games all day. My child is being more active. My child is asking questions to his father or grandfather, or wanting to learn how to cook the country food that they're bringing into the house. And so what we weren't expecting, a lot of the feedback that we got. And so it was really amazing to see how the lives of the youth are changed through the program. It wasn't something that we were really expecting. And the youth create these lifelong relationships with the elders that we work with the instructors in the program and the guides that take them out on the land. And so it's very uplifting to see, even years after they've attended the program, that they still have these relationships with the people that had they worked with through the program. And it's very amazing to see. I think that's the end of my thing. If anybody has any questions, then feel free to ask.
Thank you, Kukik. That was amazing. We received many comments back in the Q&A about how much they appreciate the program that you're doing and find it such a good opportunity for the youth in the community. I would like to just invite the two other speakers to join, Caralynn and Janice, to put their videos on. And we have a very, very short amount of time for Q&A. So I'm going to actually just ask each of you one question that came in, even though we've received multiple questions. What I'm going to suggest is that we follow up by sending each of you the questions that came in for you, and that you can write to that particular person if that works for you. And I'll have to figure out the logistics of how this works, but we'll make it work somehow. So the first question I'd actually like to ask Janice to answer. It came in asking, can someone provide an example of implementing the calls to action number 87 to 91?
So that would be a number of calls to action, and I think there are plenty of examples out there of people trying to implement the calls to action. There's no kind of formal report card that summarizes what everybody's doing across the sectors. I think that would be an impossible task. It would even be an impossible task, I think, to do a best practices kind of approach. Whoever wrote that question, thank you. Whatever sector it is that you're working in, whether it's sport, physical activity, physical education, or health, or maybe it's something different. My recommendation would be to connect with, an Indigenous organization and ask them if they could put you in touch or give you a list of maybe 3 to 5 organizations that you could follow up with online, or follow on Twitter or read about, or even just connect with to see what they're doing. Because I think what we have here are really good examples of people who are on the ground every day doing the kind of work. We have Caralynn, as well as Kukik. I'm sorry if I said your name wrong, Kukik. And by the way, that both of you, fantastic presentations. Thank you. Like, I'm not on the ground every day doing that kind of work. So it's so valuable for me and really important for me to listen to. But these are 2 really good examples of people are actually doing the work every day, what it means to them, to their community, and to the youth. And from that, it's to really think deeply about what is actually happening in that space, and not just to try and replicate it without thinking. Because the TRC process is a really deep and thoughtful process that requires a lot of thought. So that's what I would recommend.
Thank you. And one came in for Caralynn. Well, several have come in for you, but I'm going to ask this one. Your program sounds wonderful. You mentioned it was quite a spontaneous program. I'm wondering how receptive the youth and the families were when you showed up with canoes. Did you struggle to get all the participants? And if so, how did you manage that? And, a secondary question to that would be, what were some of the impacts that you saw from your program?
I'm really glad that somebody asked. I feel like I could have done a better job at clarifying how our program works. We don't just show up and knock on people's doors and say, hey, we have canoes. We do make contact with the communities beforehand. We worked in my program specifically, we worked a lot with Jordan's principal this summer. So basically how it works is we make a connection with someone in the community who is interested in having our program come. And then we kind of plan the logistics with them. Because that person or that organization who's actually in the community and living in the community obviously has a much better idea of how many participants they're going to get, who's going to be interested in the program, like what kids will want to come out and things like that. So we leave all of that kind of up to the community. As far as what I meant when I said like spontaneous, when we show up, we don't have a very, very structured, like, from this time to this time, we do this activity. And then from this time to this time, they must do this activity. It's more when we get there, we see how big the group is. We see how old the kids are, what their existing comfort level is, if any of them have been paddling before, what kind of weather we're working with, what the body of water is like. Then we kind of make sure that although yes, we have some structured things as far as like safety, obviously we always have to make sure that we're teaching the correct safety knowledge and skills, and making sure that everyone's equipment is fitting correctly and those kinds of things. But outside of the basics of like making sure that those things are established, it's very flexible as far as like, oh, the kids are really loving this game, or like they really want some free time to go and flip the canoes, like, that kind of thing is very like, we let it be led kind of like an organically of like what kind of happens during the weekend with the kids. So that is more like what I meant about spontaneous. So yes, we usually have participants who have registered with someone in the community before we show up with the boats. And then as far as the impact, some of the things like watching watching the kids' confidence grow throughout the week between when we get there and when we leave is phenomenal. Like and the ability for some of them are then helping the who are more comfortable and seem to take to it right away are then helping some of the smaller ones or the younger ones or the ones who are not quite as comfortable, and just seeing the evolution of from something being like very new and uncomfortable and they're not quite sure at the beginning, and then at the end they're like, wow, this was awesome, this was so great. And also the forming the relationships and connection with the kids as individuals throughout the week is something I think is very impactful too. In a more broader sense, like the overall, obviously the impacts of having more physical activity, more opportunities for things to do outside, especially during the summer, like when kids are out of school and they have a lot more freedom in their days. One thing that we noticed in quite a few different communities where the adults that had organized it, they were saying to us they were surprised by some of the kids who had signed up, because they're like, oh yeah, like we don't actually see so and so come out to other sport things, that like if for example, like if they had planned like a 3-on-3 basketball or maybe road hockey or whatever the activity may be, they're like, yeah, they don't really usually come out to like the community sport things like that we plan. So it's good to see them out, because usually they're like a video games kind of person. And there's something about paddling that really that draws those kids in that are usually very like introverted and more like indoor sometimes. So that's really great to see too, the impact of just getting kids out and getting them comfortable, and then the longer term effects, of course, that go along with all of that, like the whether it be employability skills, because as we get older participants, we're always looking to transition the programs like into community led, like we'll support in however we can, and like the training and helping them get their own boats and things like that. And then the idea is that it, like if you want this in your community to be like a long-term program, we'll help you get it up and running. If you need the help, we'll help in whatever way we can, and then it's yours. Like you don't need us to constantly come back, because if you have someone in the community who can run it and who's willing to do it, and they're always more than capable to find someone who is willing, usually, or has the skills, I should say. Yeah. So yes, thank you for those questions.
Great. And for Kukik, there's been many questions that have come in for you as well. I'm going to just maybe focus in on a couple of them, which is one is, do the young hunters have the opportunity after the program to go out on the land and continue to apply their skills? And another question that came in that I think is important to ask is if the girls in the community equally participate in the program.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for those questions. For sure, the youth in the program, once they've graduated out of the program, they usually are the ones in their peer group who lead their peer group on their own hunting trips. Whenever I go out on the land, I see, oh, look at that, that's a young hunter. That's a young hunter graduate. And so it's really nice to see that they're taking their other friends who don't have the opportunity to go on the land, taking them out on the land with them and teaching them what they've learned through the program. So that's really awesome to see. And we usually have an almost equal number of boys and girls in the program. We don't have a gender specific program. It's open to all youth. And we even have female instructors for our program, and female elders that we use as well. Just in the first like 5 years of the program, we were kind of funded by the Movember Foundation, and so everything had to be geared towards the young men. But we had told them, like, the funding's for young men, but is it okay if we have girls participate in the group as well? And they said it was okay, but they just only needed data, like the research data, on the young men. And so that's what we kind of focused on for the first few years. And after that, we received some funding to do a girls only. So we did a girls with gun program, or a girls with program. And so we did girls with guns, girls trapping. And so kind of spin off of the Young Hunters program only for girls.
Okay, I know we're out of time, but I do see one question that I think is really important to ask, and I will ask, are there any resources specific to individuals with disabilities in creating awareness and opportunities? If anybody has any comments on that, and then I'm going to start sharing my screen to bring the session to an end.
I think there is money out there. It's the Sport for Social Development and Indigenous Communities, and it's run through the provinces through the bilaterals. And so the money is through the Indigenous organizations for each province and territory, like the Manitoba Aboriginal Sport and Recreation Council. And then they would be part of the decision-making body to decide which communities get funded and not. So the Sport for Social Development and Indigenous Communities might be one avenue to take a look at, whoever asked that question.
Thank you so much. So what I want to do is I'm just going to share my screen very briefly, just to share some resources that have not potentially been shared in the chat. Before I do that, I want to thank each of you for talking about the hard transition that happened with colonization and how we're stepping back into places where we're comfortable on the land, we're having fun, we're storytelling, we're doing ways, we're exercising ways of being and doing, and we're being part of our culture, and really appreciate that all of that storytelling and information was shared by each of you today. So thank you so much. And I'm going to just share my final slide with how to connect with us. And thank you again for your wonderful presentations.